Hello everyone, hello and happy Thursday. It's the same old Thursday, same old editing session, but there we go. And actually, I was just thinking about this earlier. There are some people that have been, I think, from memory, people like Claudio, Earl, I think Sharon maybe, Brian, Barry, a couple of others, Michael and Ian maybe, that have been on here since we started doing this nearly a year ago. So great attendance record. Well done, everyone. And for those of you that haven't, well, you're welcome to stay around. So we have got 1 hour over the next, 59.7 minutes, where we're going to be editing Capture One. So to be clear, the editing version of, the version of Capture One that we're going to be editing today is version 21. The latest release is 21.0.2, but actually if you look in the software, it's actually called 14.0.2. Same as a lot of software companies. 21 actually refers to the year, whereas 14 refers to the version of software that you've got. If you don't have version 21, a lot of what we're going to go through today is going to be exactly the same for you. The only biggest difference that you're going to notice in terms of us using it is going to be the Dehaze function. If we do everything else, generally speaking, some of the shortcut keys and stuff we tend not to use on these sessions because you can't see what we're doing with brushes and stuff like that if we just do it sort of blindly with the keys. If you don't have version 21 and you have version 20, please make sure you're on the very latest. This is the last release of version 20. I know a few people have been asking about the latest Nikon cameras and the, I think it's Z762 and 72, whether they're coming to version 20. The answer is no. Capture One have made that quite clear that the new camera models that are being introduced from now on are going to be in version 21. They're not due to put any into version 20 from this point. So if you want to upgrade, then version 21 is there. If you want to know why you might want to upgrade, obviously there's that pro tips thing that we keep talking about, but have a look at that. It's about 20 minutes long. It will tell you the differences from version 20 to 21. If you don't have Capture One and you're just following along, then by all means download the free trial. It works for free for 30 days. Just go to capture1.com, download it. It's fully functional. There's no restrictions, no like watermarks or anything like that on there. It's literally the full piece of software, and then make the decision as to whether or not you want to move along. So, without much more said, a couple of sort of ground rules, I guess, because I forgot to mention these for the last couple of things. So, number one, there is a little bit of a delay, and this is part of streaming, unfortunately, between when you put a comment in and when I see it. So I'm not ignoring you, but please do put comments in into any of the boxes, whether you're on Facebook or YouTube, so that I can see what you're thinking, what questions you've got. If you've got any, how did you, why did you, I would have done this differently sort of thing, then please put them in. We'll try and cover them as we go. But just remember there's that little bit of lag in between you sending it in and me seeing it and being able to respond. For those of you that are viewing on Facebook, just bear in mind, Facebook is really, really bad for streaming quality. So I know a lot of people prefer Facebook over YouTube, but genuinely YouTube is going to give you 1440p or so, higher than HD, but not quite 4K. Much better and much easier to be able to see what we're doing with the images than on the YouTube stream, than on the Facebook stream, sorry. So maybe consider heading across to that. Couple of, so late, Jim's a late bloomer from Florida. That's all right, Jim, you're welcome. Where are we? Brian's just said, while we're waiting, I understand that in Capture One, holding down the Option key and clicking on the reset icon should show an edited image without the edits not working for me. We'll cover it in a second, Brian. It's not quite that simple, but yes, we'll pick that up. And well done, Claudia, for using your lunch break to come along. Right, let's get into Capture One. And we're going to start off with where we left last week. So we've got quite a few images to try and get through today. This one from Michael. We'll cover what we're going to go through in a second. In answer to Brian's question that he just put up about the option key. So there were some changes with the option keys, the undos and the resets and so on because of before and after. So basically before, Capture One had before and after. Let's just turn on our before and after. So up here, or press the Y key on the keyboard. And you've got a slider before and after, or we can change it to be full view. Bear in mind that before and after isn't actually back to the original RAW, because if you make any crop adjustments, and there are a couple of other things, for instance, curves and stuff, the before shot isn't actually the pure image, it's the modified one. So it's got any keystone changes or any crop changes or anything like that also applied to it. But in general terms, this gives you a quick ability to see before and after. But if you want to see one tool in particular and the difference that's made, so let me just just for the sake of it, let's just go and create a new filled layer. So on the top left, new filled layer. So I've got a mask that's on everything. And with this layer, I'm just going to pick on my white balance and make it really, really warm and really, really pink. Well, obviously, if I do before and after, I'm going to go back to the original. If I want to see just what that difference has made, I can reset that tool. But if I hold down the Option key or the Alt key and hold down my mouse, that's the most important part. As long as I've got the key held down and the mouse held down, it temporarily shows me everything apart from this tool change on that layer. Let go of the mouse and we're back again. Mouse back on, back again. But the whole time I've kept the Alt key or the Option key held down with my finger. So you can go one by one into each of these tools that you've made changes into and undo that step temporarily by holding down the Alt key, or permanently if you don't hold down the Alt key and you press it. The reset button up here, not quite the same thing. That's going to literally take you back to the pre-edit, no changes variant, or the original as it were. And the undo button up here is slightly different. This undo button here resets this tool on this layer. So again, think about that as well. If you've got multiple layers with different white balances on, the one that you undo here doesn't reset white balance across all of those layers. It resets the white balance on this layer, and the same with the Option key. So it's temporarily on this layer, permanently on this layer, but it won't affect the white balances on any other layer. The undo button up here is slightly different. That's an undo of steps. So for example, if I click on this image, click on this image, click on this image, and go to undo, it's not going to undo the last thing I did to an image. It's going to take me back to the last thing I did, which was click on an image. Undo again, go back to that image. Undo again, go back to that image. None of those were editing steps. They were just things that I did in Capture One. So the undo button up here is a global anything I do, any mouse click I make, any keyboard I make, or keyboard click I do, undo it. The reset button here takes you back to the original. So any of the changes that you made, any of the adjustments, they're gone. These buttons here undo this particular tool on this particular layer. And if I hold down the Option key, it temporarily undoes it. That was quite a lot to get through, actually, just describing undo, but there we go. Those are the different things in there. So, and then the natural question, I knew this had come up from someone, so Martin's the winner of this prize. So all the info is there, so why can't we have a history panel? The answer is, Martin, I don't know. I'm sure it's harder than you and I both think, but yes, all the information is there. It is all tracked in an undo button up here. Bear in mind the undo button obviously releases the second that we come out of Capture One or out of this catalog or so on, so it empties that, so we don't necessarily have history in that sense. But I would hazard a guess that it's not impossible that Capture One might be looking at doing something with history, because you're not alone in asking for it. It's quite often requested, and you know, I agree, it would be a really, really handy thing to have. But in the meantime, you do have those tools. So ultimate reset or big reset button on the top left, undo and redo of every step I do, regardless of whether it's an adjustment. It could just be me clicking on a different folder, going to the color balance tool, or it could be selecting a different image or a rating or a color, anything, or color tag or anything. And then you've got the individual tools, which, remember, it's not a global undo for that tool, it's an undo for that tool on that layer. There we go. So let's get started on that note. So now we've done that. In fact, there is one other thing I wanted to show people, because it came up on Facebook a couple of days ago. And genuinely, it's a let's call it a choice. It's a personal choice. We talked about the Workspace stuff beforehand, in terms of editing these tools and so on. Earl's just asked, I'm just going to show you. So if you mistake, click on the big reset button. So this is an image here. Click on the reset button. It's gone back to its base image. I can indeed undo that click. The thing to get your head around is it's not undoing the reset itself. It's undoing the thing that I did with my mouse, if that makes sense. That will help hopefully make it click in people's heads. So in terms of the outline here, so I've just set up my little proof margin. So by clicking up here, we've got our ability to have a margin around our image. when you go to print an image, if you're designing your image for screen, having a black background, nothing wrong with that. Pretty good idea, actually, because a lot of stuff in the background, especially when we come to theatre viewers and galleries that people have on websites and stuff like that, the background is black. So makes sense, no problem. When you go to print, it can be really helpful to set this background to white. And I'm hoping you can see this in the stream. So basically, what I look at here as being actually quite bright, quite illuminated and so on. Then when I go to print it, it comes out and it's a bit dark and a bit dull and a bit boring and so on. And why is that? Well, the reason is because we're comparing it to black. And of course, you can use your histogram to give you a guide, but sometimes having this white background will really help you understand how deep and rich those blacks are, how bright the whites really are. Actually, as well, for white balance, whether it's right. So at the moment, we've got a little bit of a tint in here, out in the snow here. You know, is this really pure white? Having a white proof margin can help. If you don't want the proof margin, so let me just switch that back to black for this purpose. If you don't want the proof margin, this is the icon up here. Just click on it and it goes away, and then your image is going to fill the whole screen rather than have this this beautiful margin around the edge to compare. So if you're creating stuff for print, the white margin can be really useful. If you're doing it for online or for screen use effectively, it's not so important, but it does give you a baseline for using as a reference for your white balance, if we want to call it that. So, Michael's shot, and we stopped last week on this one, and we're going to talk about noise, we're going to talk about exposure, or pushing exposure, let's call it that, as in terms of how far we can get it to go. So, first things first on any of these shots, this was Michael's edit. There's a lot of information in here, a lot of layers, which is really useful because I can see what he's doing with each one. But let's go back to the raw, pure image. So this is the original. The original image in this case is very dark. I think we're all going to agree on that one. But of course, we've got a lot more dynamic range that the camera could see that's maybe not in our visible histogram here. And the way that we see that is we pull up exposure or down exposure if we want to have a look at that way. So if we pull up our exposure all the way, we get back to close of where Michael was at here in the final shot. But look at out here. I mean, wow, this bit that was bright, and this is a very difficult scene. You've got a bright area in the middle and a really dark area around it. This bit's now completely overexposed. If I turn on my exposure warning, I'm going to see the areas that are overexposed. So the first temptation is to pull up the exposure, but then try and recover those highlights. So let's have a little look at what we can do. And this is where I'm going to repeat something that we talked about maybe a couple months ago. But I want to make sure that people have really understood this. The exposure warning is not the same when it disappears as we've got all the data back. The exposure warning is telling you that an area in here is clipping at 255, 255, 255, 255, either red, green, blue, or a mix of those channels at 255 or above. That clipping amount comes from my preferences in here. And if I go to exposure, I can choose the color of my exposure warning and also the limit. So I have mine set at 255. A lot of people have them set down at, I think the default is lower, like 250 or something like that. And it's a warning, remember. It's telling you, look, risk. There's a risk that we don't have any data in here. But sometimes when something is pulled so bright in the scene, we have a little bit of a problem when it comes to recovering it, because if I just use this warning to tell me that, okay, we've got all the detail back, and pull this down, well, now I don't have an exposure warning. Great. But I certainly don't have any detail back. And the reason is because now this level here, as I move my mouse over it, is no longer 255. You can see at the top, it's 211, 211, 211. But the fact those numbers are all the same is also telling me something. It's telling me there's no real color data in there. There's no real signal that got into the sensor beyond just blowing it out. So what I'm looking at is, even if I were to pull this up back to there, we're at 251, probably a little bit higher than that maybe, but I don't have an exposure warning anymore. Great. But I also don't have any data. So it doesn't matter what I do to this area with highlights, whites, pulling down the exposure, anything like that. Once an area of your picture is completely blown out, and by that I don't mean in the visible histogram, I mean in the dynamic range that your camera can collect. Once you go beyond that, it doesn't matter what you do in terms of getting rid of this exposure warning. You're not getting any detail back. You're just darkening that overexposed bit. So now the overexposed area is, as we look on the top, 158. Brilliant. According to our histogram over here on the left, if you watch where the orange bar goes, this is no longer overexposed. Great. It's now right there in the midtones. But because it was overexposed and was really overexposed, all of that pulling down of that information makes no difference to the detail coming back. It's just changing the brightness of that area that was overexposed. So be careful using the exposure warning. It's not necessarily going to tell you the truth. It's going to give you a warning, and that's what it's for. To grab your attention to say, hey, look at this area over here. You might want to do something with it. So that's our first thing around exposure. So although the temptation would be then to bring up everything else, the more we do that, of course, the more we overexpose this area here. So we've got another little trick that we can use to try and rescue some of this, which is our curve. So at the moment it's auto. Auto, as we know, and we've talked about it over many weeks now, adds in a bit of an S curve, so it punches some contrast. It makes the brights brighter, the darks darker, just to give your image a bit of a, I guess, default pop. Let's call it that. So if I change this from auto to linear response, look at what happens. Now, of course, I could recover this. So this is the other thing to bear in mind. I can recover an auto curve back down because it hasn't changed the raw data. The underlying information is still there. But I'm starting off from a different place. And especially if you look at this fence area up here, just above the highlight warning. In fact, let's just turn off the exposure. No, we'll leave it on, actually. Let me switch this from auto back to linear response. And we see two things happen. The first is we've got a lot more detail in the areas that aren't overexposed. The second is our overall exposure warning area has shrunk a little bit. If I go without and with, you can see it contracts a bit. Not a huge amount, but that linear response curve is just calming down those highlights a little bit. And when we calm them down, we've probably got a bit more data that we can play with in there. So with a linear response curve, that's going to help us. Where it's also going to help us, it's a bit, you know that thing shooting in the dark? I'm literally shooting in the dark up here. I'm hoping I've chosen the right area. So let's just go back to our auto curve and pull up the sky. Look at this noise up here. So I'm going to clone this variant so it's exactly the same picture. So there and there, but on this one, I'm going to load in the linear response curve. Now, while the linear response curve has reduced some contrast, it's also had the effect of effectively softening that noise, because it's not grabbing all of those little peaks of highlights in the noise and little bits of darkness in the noise and pushing them a little bit with that little S contrast boost. It's flattening it off. Now, that's not great for my mountain, because in my mountain, I might want a bit more of that contrast, but we can deal with that differently. So this is just talking about our starting point. So if I look at this image that Michael sent in, we've got two issues that I think we need to deal with. One is this area here is still too overexposed, even though the rest of the image is still dark. And two, this noise up here is pretty extreme. I mean, this is some heavy noise. And of course it's going to be heavy noise because it's come out of a shadow of 0. You know, these areas in the sky, if I go before and after, there was nothing here. I mean, 1, 1, 1, according to that top part up there. You know, there's out of a scale of 255, there's 1 in red, green and blue channels. And I dare say that was even pretty risky, claiming that. So there's a certain point where it goes from noise recovery and noise reduction to we're starting to introduce artifacts. And this stuff on the right is what I'd call an artifact. It's not just noise, it's the patterns that come from overdoing noise reduction. And that's going to be a problem when you're pulling up a histogram by so much. So let's start with our little clone down here that we started with our linear response curve. I'm not going to pull the exposure for the whole shot up. I'm going to leave that probably about 2. What I am going to do is pull our highlights all the way down and our whites all the way down. We might come back to that exposure as well in a minute. Yeah, John's just asked a question. I guess you shot at f13 to get the starburst and the lights. Yeah, I mean, it's not quite as simple. It's funny. Someone asked me about a year ago. What aperture do I need to do to get starburst? It depends, because it's not that simple. It's actually there's a ratio between the size of the point of light, the amount of contrast between that and the surrounding areas and so on. But at f13 for sure, in this sort of scenario, you're gonna see starbursts. You can get starbursts at f5.6 if you're on the right lens in the right scenario with the right size of point of light. But yeah, in this case for street lights, typically anything above f8 on a wide lens or f11 on generally any lens, f16 is pretty safe, but once you get into that territory, you're going to be seeing the little pinwheels of stars. So with our exposure pulled up and our our highlights and our whites pulled down, we can already see, if I look at the original from Michael here and this one here, we're not fixing the overexposed stuff, in part because we can't. But what we have got is a bit more detail on the right-hand one than we do on the original, or the edit that Michael sent in. So by not pulling up our exposure quite so much, using a flattened curve and recovering completely those highlights and whites, we get a bit more detail back into this highlighted area here. Where are we? So, next up, let's try and pull up our shadows. Now, remember there's a difference in the histogram between shadows and blacks. So blacks is the very, very, very bottom part of the histogram. Let's call it the bottom 5%. Shadows is the bottom roughly 20-25% of that histogram too. If we pull up blacks alone, I'm going to do this so you can see. So let's pull up blacks alone. Everything that was very, very, very dark is now going to be lifted. But here's the problem. You get this weird sort of effect here where it's almost flattened things. And the reason is because it's taken those darkest parts and squashed them into the lower midtones. But the bit that was between the blacks and the lower midtones has sort of not moved quite as much because it's only focused on the blacks. So unfortunately, as we pull that up, you get this weird effect where it's not quite the same and not quite as nice as a general exposure lift. Shadows is going to grab more of that clump, so it's going to grab more of this data here. Frankly, we could do this with a Luma curve down the bottom, but the shadows tool's there to do it for us anyway. So we're going to pull those shadows up by quite a bit. I wouldn't normally do this up to this level, but that's kind of what it needs. And you'll see the difference between blacks pulled up on their own and shadows pulled up on their own. This is a lot more natural to pull up a bigger chunk of that information than just the bottom 5%. We can, of course, bring up blacks a tiny bit too. But remember, that bottom 5%, those blacks in the histogram, are also storing all this noise. So as we do that, that's going to really affect how much noise we're bringing into the image. So we might pull it up a couple points, but really no more than that. Okay, so let's have a little look at out here. And we're going to go into our noise reduction tab. Now the noise reduction, this is another thing that people get confused by. On your background layer, sharpening and noise reduction will default to what Capture One has decided is the right amount for this lens, sensor, and so on combination. If I create a new layer, these go to 0. The amount is 0. The amount here on noise reduction is 0. So no sharpening, no noise reduction, no luminance reduction, detail reduction, and so on. But it is still, because it's doing it on the background, and these are additive. So I think we sort of covered it the other day, but if I over sharpen, oh sorry, this isn't a filled layer, let's just fill that layer. If I over sharpen this layer here, this is, and you can see these horrible artifacts going to start to appear. This is on top of the sharpening on my background. So they're cumulative. So be really careful with this. What can happen is you can create a layer, that was weird. You can create a layer. Think you've gone into that layer and think, oh, there's no sharpening and no noise reduction in this picture. Let's wind them up. Be very careful with that because you'll find that on your background layer, it's already doing it. You can obviously add more in another layer, but your sharpening and noise reduction are going to default and auto on your background layer. And in this case, I kind of want to get to a point where we are increasing our noise reduction a little bit. Capture One from version, can't remember, it was either 12 or 20, one of those two, got a lot better with noise reduction. But in this particular case, this particular shot, there's so much noise in these shadows. what I'm going to do is reduce the risk of introducing noise by not bringing up those darkest parts of the image in the first place. So out here, look, where we've got a lot of detail, and obviously the camera is getting more information rather than just noise in the shadows, we don't have to worry too much because it is all there. But up here, where this was solid black, let's go to our before and after. Anything it pulls up in terms of shadow, it's also going to pull up that noise. And some of this will be sensor heat noise and so on, but we kind of want to get away from that being a distraction. So what I would do with this shot is immediately put on a gradient. And the reason for that is I don't mind that the sky is dark. It makes sense that the sky is dark. So if I turn this on, press the M key on the keyboard, we can see our mask. My sky up here, I'm going to darken down intentionally. So there's two ways of doing this. One is we can brighten up, we can do a layer to brighten up the foreground. The other is we brighten up the background layer and we darken down the sky. That's what we're going to do on here. So I'm going to call it dark sky. So with our background now, I can afford just to push this a little bit more. So we might want to push it to, I don't know, let's go for another third of a stop up. And maybe we pull our shadows just a touch more as well. And I'm going to pop that clarity. Interesting. You can now see my thought process live online. We're going to do the opposite. I'll tell you why. I don't want to have to undo clarity in that sky. That doesn't make sense to me. So instead of doing it this way, we're going to create a new layer and call it foreground. And with that, I'm going to draw my new little gradient that's going to cover up to these mountains. And this layer alone, we're going to add to that exposure. Again, about a third of a stop, just like I did before. And we're going to pull up shadows a bit. Just bear in mind as well, your HDR layers, or sorry, your HDR adjustments are also cumulative. So if you have one layer as a background and you've done a load of highlight recovery, and you have another layer on top and do some more highlight recovery, it will try it again and again. But bear in mind what I showed you at the start. There comes a point where it can't recover anymore anyway, so that it becomes futile. But in this case, for shadow, yes, we can pull up the foreground a bit more than we had before. And I'm going to pull up clarity by quite a bit. And the reason that I did that switch is because I only want the clarity to affect this part, not the sky. So rather than trying to undo it with a layer on top, I'm not going to do it to the sky in the first place. Out here, well, let's see what we can do with our highlights and our whites. So we can get a bit back by doubling up. So remember, we've got a background which has got full highlight and white recovery, and a foreground which has got a bit more highlight and white recovery. Which one's better? Yeah, I'm not too sure. In fact, I might even pull down this exposure pop because that is affecting this area here, and rely purely on the shadow pop instead. Let's just do a bit more recovery into there. And let's see, is that helping us? And always with this, we want to have a look at that layer. Is it helping us, or is it making things worse? And I want to make sure that everything we're doing isn't making things worse to the image. It's actually helping recover detail. Okay, overall then, on our background, let's go back to our white balance, and I'm tempted to cool it down a bit, and also just to get rid of some of the green tint. We obviously have this challenge here with the snow. We could force this to go white. Let's just choose a little picker here. Don't choose a bit of the snow that's under a light. If we try and get the picture out here on the right to be neutral and white, that doesn't make much sense whatsoever because it's not white. The snow is reflecting the light that was coming from this street lamp, which was yellow. So we need to find an area out here that is neutral and in the shadows. So maybe there. Okay, it's made us a bit greener than I wanted, so I'm just going to correct for that a little bit. But it's not far off. That's looking pretty good. Damien's just said, what about luminosity mask on the highlights? It's the same thing, Damien. So even if I go into here... oops. Didn't mean to do the white balance change. Even if I go into here and were to select the highlights alone in their luminosity, there's not much more I can do with it. Because when I try and pull down those areas, so let's imagine I select all the areas which are very bright, pulling them down in exposure, they're just going to go grey. There's no more detail in there. So I think we've stretched this as far as we can in terms of getting detail back. And at that point, it doesn't matter really what we do to it. It can't go any more. Andy's saying, can you type a higher value than 100 for the adjustments? No. But what you can do, as I say, is double up on them. Just be careful if you're going to do that. And just to show you in that sense, let's go to a filled layer. So I can go to clarity and go boom, 100. And then I can create a new filled layer. Clarity, boom, another 100. Then a new filled layer. Clarity, boom, another 100. And then we end up where we were the other week about talking about Instagram posts. But yes, you can add more than 100, but you have to do it with a cumulative layer, one on top of the other to do it. Out here in the mountains, though, so let's just add a new layer, and I'm going to call it mountains, because I do want these to stand out a little bit. And all I'm going to do is with a really rough brush. In fact, we'll leave it at 100. That's fine. And I'm just going to select this area, being careful not to go too far or too close to the very, very edges of them, because I don't really want to halo into the sky. And remember, I've excluded the sky from some of this clarity work. But with those mountains, what we can do is we can go onto our contrast tool a little bit. That's going to darken down a lot of the darker bits. And also then use our clarity tool just to lift them as mountains. So let's go without and with. That makes them pop a little bit more. Pretty good. But what we've now got in this scene is a shot that doesn't have too much noise up here, certainly not in terms of artifacts, compared to the original edit. So while it's subtle, I'm hoping you can see on the screen, but the original one is on the left, the new one is on the right. You should be able to see, I hope, there's less of this patterny stuff happening here. Again, it's not going to make a huge difference with what we do here, because there's so much noise in this shot. But I'm in a place where the new version on the right is a bit more neutral. We haven't got that green tint that's happening over here with some of the mountains. And more importantly, let's just go into here. We've got a little more detail back in these steps here. And that comes from using that linear response curve in the first place. And we can see there's a lot more information down here, a lot cleaner, a lot crisper, a lot sharper, without a lot of the noise that came with it. And then would you, Brian's just asked, would you use brightness instead of exposure to keep the highlights in check? Potentially. The issue with brightness is, and especially in this shot, funnily enough, what happened there? We lost. That was weird. We lost capture one for a second. Okay, so would I use brightness instead? The issue with doing it is brightness tends to flatten contrast. So the problem with flattening the contrast, especially in this shot here, is we are going to end up in this situation where, well, let me just zoom out a second. For some reason, that weird blip has changed my zoom ability. We don't have a lot of contrast to start with in here. We've got extremes, and brightness would prevent that from happening. But what brightness is going to do is it's going to flatten down any of these bits that are approaching the sort of lower midtones. And we can do it, but you're going to find that we lose some of that punch that we built in with contrast and clarity and so on. And then, where are we? Mobius just said, so would a touch of Dehaze produce any useful results? Macca's just said she's going to bed, so that's okay. Well, he's going to bed. So that's okay. I'm not sure. Macca, are you? I don't know if you're... Oh, okay. You're in Queensland. That's okay. You're allowed to go. It's a different time zone. That's allowed. So would a touch of Dehaze produce any useful results? It could do. In my experience with Dehaze, it can also, though, bring up some noise. So just be really careful with that. So, oh yeah, although that's on our mountain layer. Let's just go back to our background. Let's just add in Dehaze. Ooh, okay. So I wasn't predicting that, but I have seen similar things, and it sort of doesn't matter what shadow tone I try and use. You still get this weird mottled effect with the noise. So unfortunately, Dehaze in a high noise environment, I'm not in a place of thinking it's going to help us too much. But in answer to Michael's question, the way to get rid of this noise in part is to go subtly. So not to push all of these things too high, not to try and recover too much, not to try and push the image beyond its limits of the original camera's dynamic range. But there are things we can do to try and calm it down and try focus. You know, the key thing here is if we've got lots of noise in the sky, then maybe we make less of a feature of the sky and don't brighten it up by quite so much, so you don't see it quite so much as well. Okay, so yeah, here's a good before and after. Before, after. There we go. Right, let's have a look at Claudio's shot. Oh, hold on. Sorry, I missed a question. Funnily enough, from Claudio about someone else's images. So, what do we do in these night cityscape scenes? Blur the highlights and get more details in the shadows and blacks, or go bracketing. So, the short answer is, in some cases, you have to just choose. You've got to make your decision at the point that you capture it. What are you willing to sacrifice? If your camera's got a lot of dynamic range, and I don't know what this one was shot on. Let's just have a little look. Oh, it's a Sony A7R 4. So it's a decent dynamic range camera. It's just this original scene was so dark. So yeah, in this case here, actually there is another route, which is to use a center weighted GND filter. So of course you can get circular or radial GND filters where the center is darker, and they're used for sunsets and sunrises. In this case, that could have helped, because it could have meant that you could have darkened down this part down here, allow the rest of it to expose for a bit longer. Maybe that would have helped a little bit. But generally speaking, you know, once something is completely blown, you don't have any ability to get it back. When a shadow is underexposed, you do have some ability to get it back. So you've got to be a little bit careful with what levers you want to pull to try and recover the image. But in broad terms, where we want to get to is try and protect the highlights as much as you can. It is perfectly reasonable in this case here that if we've got an area here like this light or this ski slope here, I presume it's a ski slope, but is that going to be overexposed? Of course it is. You've got bright lights pointing at the camera in a dark scene, so I'm not expecting it to be correctly exposed. But I would try and protect the real bright parts, not the complete blowouts like lights and street lights, but the real bright parts of the image, and then see what you can do with the shadows. Or blend. So 2 exposures, 1 for the highlights, 1 for the shadows, and then hopefully you'll be able to get it back. Okay. So yeah, Michael just said I use no filters and no bracketing, so it's a bit of hard work. Yeah, honestly, in this sort of shot, these are tough shots to edit. There are other tools out there that do a stronger job of noise reduction. I talked about one last week called Noiseware. They can do a good job of trying to fix it, but just remember, we're in a mode of fixing when we start talking about those sort of heavyweight tools. We're not in a mode of edit. We're genuinely trying to fix. Okay, so let's go to Claudio's picture. So quite wintry, quite apt up here at the moment. So this tree here, first thing on it. So number 1, really nice shot. Love this shot. It's a nice tone, nice contrast, nice. It's the right amount of fog and stuff. Please, people, don't do this. I've seen in the last couple of weeks, I've seen so many people using all of the all of the sliders for Dehaze to try and make every picture completely clear and crisp. This picture works because of that atmosphere. It works because of the fog, the mist. In fact, if you wanted to, you could even introduce more. I wouldn't. It's captured pretty well as it is. If we did want to make this clearer, rather than using Dehaze, what I would do, potentially, and again, it's up to you, is use levels to do that clarity improvement. And again, it allows me to be a bit more subtle. It's just brightening up those whites and so on. Going back to what we were saying earlier about proof margins. So this is a bright white picture. Let's change to white. And actually, no, it's not. It's a grey picture. And this is one of the reasons why using that white margin for print can be really, really powerful, because it allows us to match what should be white to actually what would be white, as in 255, 255, 255. So I'm not going to make it completely white. I'm going to make it sort of off up here, but certainly so that we're peaking. And what I'm looking for is on my exposure warning, have I made anything too close to that 255? So there we go. That's our limit there. I'm going to switch back off of the white margin to a black one. And then I look at the second thing with this one, and I'm going to guess that, Claudio, I don't think you took this picture leaning. I think maybe it's on a slight slope or on a slight hill, which is fine for the picture. And then we go into this same conversation we've had before, which is about the difference between a print on a wall and a picture of a memory. So for what you saw there, this was probably completely upright, and there's no issue with this angle. On a print on a wall, I'm gonna, and this is maybe just me personally, a bit weird, but I find it a little distracting when the thing is leaning slightly. I don't have a problem if it's leaning a lot, and I don't have a problem if it's level, but when it's slightly off, it just feels uncomfortable. So what I'm going to do is just start with a clone variant. And I'm going to use, again, what I don't want to do is use our rotate tool. Because if I rotate this, now my tree is leaning over. That doesn't make sense. So that looks worse. Let's not do that. Undo button. Again, there we go. So I just undid my, my rotate. Instead, and we've done this on a couple of images before, we can use our Keystone tool, the horizontal Keystone tool, to stretch a part of the image. And here's the difference. If I rotate, I literally turn. I twist and rotate the image around the point that I designate with the long line. Tongue-tied today for no reason. If I use the Keystone tool, I can stretch one edge more than the other. So it means that we don't change the upright elements of the image, we're just changing the perspective or the perspective distortion of either the right or the left-hand side if we use the horizontal one. So what I can do is say, we'll leave this up here as it is. But down here, I'm just going to pull this keystone up and hit apply. So now I've got a level ground, but I haven't made the tree fall over. And this is the difference between using your perspective correction and using rotate. Rotate is literally one big lump of a movement. It's just going to pick the picture up and turn it. Perspective correction, as you can see from the margin that we're losing here, is pulling and stretching. And it's leaving this top part relatively straight, but the bottom part here is really pulling away in this bottom left-hand corner, which has the effect of making the ground appear straight. So if I now hit the arrow key, now I have a level ground. The tree's not falling over. All of these are still vertical. There's no problem there. It just feels a bit more comfortable. Then, so on this one, it's Olympus shot. We've got to be, what's the thing that goes wrong with Olympus shots at the moment in 21? I can't remember. Claudio, you have to remind me, but there's something that we try and it doesn't quite work. I think it's masking or something like that. Anyway, let's create a new gradient layer because I want to do something a little bit different here. And we're going to draw a layer up. So my red area here. And with this layer, here's a fun one, dehaze, negative dehaze. Now, there is a challenge with this, which is choosing the right shadow tone for your dehaze. And at the moment, it had chosen this sort of dark blue color. I want it to choose the same haze as the fog up here, so the really bright stuff. Maybe not quite so bright, maybe there. But what this is doing is it's allowing me to take some of the distraction of the foreground away. I don't want to do it quite this much, so I'm actually going to use the layer opacity, so this one up here, and pull this down until I find the amount that I'm happy with. So that's with no change. That's with the full change. This is about halfway. That sort of suits me. So what I'm doing is I'm subtly adding in haze, funnily enough, into this foreground and reducing the color by choosing this shadow tone here to effectively push the viewer back up towards the tree. So where are we? A couple of questions on this. So Claudia said, yeah, it's taking on a slight hill. Pablo, I was thinking of mixing straight tool and vertical keystone. This way is much better. Yeah, so, try... If you are going to do keystone to do a rotation, try not to use the four-way keystone. Only ever use either the vertical or the horizontal. If you're trying to stretch a horizon or trying to make a horizon, especially what you'll find is on rivers, when you're photographing a river and the river goes away from you, rather than rotating it, which means everything just then leans, you can use your keystone tool to pull it towards you in the same way that you can use tilt-shift lenses on cameras to do it. We can just do it with a keystone tool instead. So, and then where was the other one? Sorry, Paula, after the first excitement of the Dehaze tool, I got back to the tools I used beforehand and just use it for finishing touch. Yeah, so genuinely, and I'll go on to another image in a minute. I said this from the very beginning. If you're willing to put the time in and spend the effort and the energy in getting it right, you can do better than the Dehaze tool yourself through curves and clarity and levels changes and so on. And actually, Capture One will say that too. That's not a marketing cover up or anything. It's not a blip. The Dehaze tool is designed as a quick way of getting to sort of 70 or 80% very easily, and that's what it does very well. But if you really want to get into fine-tuning and really pulling out details that you control, that's where the other tools come in into their own. So then with this shot, where were we? I wanted to just have a little look as to whether or not a black and white version of it would work. And the problem I've got is because there's not a lot of color in the original shot, other than this sort of reddy green, reddy yellowy color. It's very difficult to use these sliders, these filter sliders, to control the contrast in there. So instead of that, what we might want to do is maybe actually go into one of the, oops, where are we? Beyond black and white, I think it's 4, no, maybe not, maybe even 1, just to see what we get. I think that's overdone. I actually prefer, I think, the color version of it. And even with a black and white conversion, as it were, if we did that, if I start pulling up some of our contrasts and stuff like that, I think it's going to go too harsh. Oops, sorry, that's the foreground. We don't want that one. Contrast up here, it's going to go too harsh, and I don't like it. I think we are genuinely in a good place with this nice, soft color tone. We could cool it down a bit. I think Pablo's just mentioned that. You know, we could cool it a touch. But I think, again, even with that, I like it as it is. I like the way that... I'm on the wrong layer again. Stupid. So we could cool it down a little bit, but I just think I prefer the original toning of it. Maybe with a tiny tweak, and that's it. Brian says, is there any way to shift the panel up a bit? I'm not sure with our crop. We might. Yeah, we've got a little bit of room up there. So we can do, just to give this a bit more breathing space above the tree. Yep, absolutely. So there we go. So we did that a few weeks ago. It's made a huge difference to editing. So there we go. Don't always just run for the dehaze tool, the rotate tool. Sorry, mind blank. To straighten your images. If it is literally turned and on a slope, then yes, that's what the straighten tool's for. But if it's about perspective or a slight rise and a hill, like in this case, Keystone tool can be really powerful to do that. Claudius just said he added a clarity layer on top. Yeah, I'm torn, to be honest, Claudius. So let's do that. And it's going to just pop it a bit, but I don't know. I like the... I like the fact that these fall out in the background. I genuinely, I think you've captured it spot on. So I think genuinely it's a case of less is more in this case. If I go to before and after, you know, we have cooled it. We've got rid of some of the focus down here in the bottom. We've certainly cooled down this in the foreground. We've straightened it, which is one key thing. So we go from, let's just go from there to there. So as a print, this is going to fit nicer on a wall. It's going to feel nicer on a wall. You might want to nip this little tree out here with a bit of negative dehaze as well. But yeah, overall, I would leave this as a print. It looks really nice. Okay, so where are we? Viankov. I think your name's Viankov. We were trying to check earlier. We didn't get back from you in time. So going back to the point I made just now about clarity versus dehaze and curves and so on. Here is what dehaze can do with this shot. Frankly, a really good job. Raven out on a branch, and dehaze is going to make this nice and clear, crisp. Add a bit more color into it, because that's part of the result of dehaze, especially if you push it all the way to 100, you can get some color introduced in here. So that's what dehaze does out of the box. There versus there. But I think doing it with levels alone is a lot more natural. So I'm going to clone this variant. I'm actually going to undo these levels, and we're going to do it with dehaze. And you can take a look. So I'm not going to do it massively. I'm going to do it sort of 60 out of 100. So that's the dehaze version. That's the levels version. So levels is on the left, dehaze is on the right. And to me, there's a couple of things. Number one, this feels more natural in this particular instance. Not always, but in this instance it does. But number two, this then forces me to think about other elements of the image. So rather than just relying on one slider to pull it up, what we can do is we can pick on our curve now and say, well, actually, these darker parts down here, I just want to lighten those up a little bit. That looks pretty good. Where are we there? And then maybe I might want to add an extra layer on for the raven. So we'll call that layer raven. Let's just go and get one image up instead of multiple. So on this layer here, what we could do is maybe paint. So a very rough area in here. And all I'm going to do is just pump that clarity a little bit because it's looking for areas. It doesn't matter that I was rough. Obviously, if I was being neater, I could be. But it is picking up on that raven overall. And I then get to the point of, this is the one with, what did we do? So one little clarity boost, a little less curve, and some levels changes. Compared to the Dehaze version, the Dehaze version gets us there a lot quicker, for sure. But this one just feels more natural. Look at this detail in the background that Dehaze hasn't picked up because we haven't done any of those little fine-tuning tweaks. We haven't done any curve adjustment, any levels change or anything like that. We've relied on Dehaze. So Dehaze is great because it's separated this foreground from the background. But some of this background's quite interesting, surely. So you then end up in this place where hopefully people will understand Dehaze is a wonderful tool if you need Dehaze specifically. If you're trying to add your own take on atmosphere or, you know, adding in some cases, Rehaze is actually a really fun tool to use with the Dehaze slider, but adding in little nuances into a picture, it's these other tools, it's the levels tools, it's the curves tools, it's the clarity sliders, it's the HDR sliders. Those are the bits that allow you to edit individual parts of the image a lot better. And in the case of this Raven, so let's go Raven 2. What I'm going to do is just do a I'm being very lazy on masks today. Let's just draw a quick mask over our Raven. I'm going to go to Luma range. And with our Luma range, I'm going to select everything that's nice and dark, i.e. the Raven, and not the background. There we go, pretty good. Let's have a little bit of a radius just in case I've clipped some bits I didn't want. And with that, we can now pump the contrast. We could do a little bit of clarity on there as well. And actually, there's a little bit of a red and a blue tint on that Raven now as a result of that. So I'm just going to pull that back. Whoa, not by that much. There we go. So where I head to very quickly is the worry that I have in my head is when we start talking about one slider to do something, we kind of look at it as a magic bullet. When you stop yourself from doing that, so when you use Dehaze, I think someone said earlier, I can't remember who it was, someone mentioned about, oh, it was Paula, sorry, I even read it out, using Dehaze as a finishing touch. Absolutely, because the mindset then changes. You start talking about using Dehaze to add that final little pop or change, but you've already been through all the other tools that you know can do amazing work beforehand. So to me, I sort of look at Dehaze as a get out of jail card now. If we need to do something very quickly at the end just to make it pop, does a great job. If I need to add fog, then yep, it does a great job of that as well. But I would still personally stick to a natural edit on the left versus the one-click solution on the right. Of course, you could take the Dehaze solution and then further fine tweak it as well. But I just prefer in my head the thought process of what am I trying to do to an image overall. Well, you also just said I use Rehaze more than Dehaze. Yeah, I'm not surprised. Lots of people are saying that at the moment. And actually, Rehaze is a really good tool as long as you choose the right shadow tone. That's the key to that tool. Okay, so let's just come on to one shot. Are we going to hit that one or Alan's? We're going to go on to Andreas's just for now. So this is, I think, Vienna, you said, Andreas. I'm not sure if you're on. So there are multiple shots of this opera house. This is the original that you're seeing here on the screen. So before and after is the same. And then what Andreas has done is lots and lots of different versions of it in terms of edits. Selective color one, obviously, in here. This one here, which is a bit further back. We've got a lot of vignetting up here. This one, which is, pretty geometric and pretty cool. I sort of get to the point of this one being my preference out of it. I'm not actually going to change the edit. I just wanted you guys to see what a difference a few things can make. So number one, this is the original, obviously. It needs quite a bit of work to get it up to this point, and Andreas has done that work. So in part, we've cooled it down. In part, we've got some tint change and so on. We might have, in some of them, we've reduced some saturation. He's picked on this often in the middle, so the open sign in red, in selective to do that. So there's different ways of treating it, but ultimately, this comes down to your view on how the picture needs to be. Because this one looks really powerful as a geometric shape. It's right in your face. It's a really powerful print. This one, not so. This one feels more set back. You're not part of it. It's not imposing. This one, we all know the classic sort of selective color trick. In this scenario here, I think it works better than a lot of other ones. Certainly when I see the random guy with a red rose that's in color and everything else in black and white. Not a fan of that, but this actually really works. But to me, this is probably the best setup out of them. So it's got distortion correction in the front with these lights, which have actually worked really well. We've got a bit of a pull because it's an ultra wide lens. Well, 23, it's not ultra wide, but it's certainly pulling out these lights. But the toning in this and everything is really, really spot on. Really, really nicely done, Andres. Okay, and then on to Alan's. So, Alan's shot here. I just wanted to pick on something on here. So, this is actually a full color shot. It's a yellow corridor. It's a really nice black and white conversion. Alan's actually done a huge amount of work on this shot. So, there's subtle grads up here, or gradient filters up here and on the left. We've got some healing that's been done up here on these cracks. There's, believe it or not, down here we've got a load of lights. Let's just go into there, which have all been removed. So when someone says to me the healing brush in Capture One doesn't work, I would say Alan will disagree with you. But there's one thing that you didn't touch on, Alan, which I just want to show you just in case you didn't know or it wasn't one that you'd played with before. On the black and white conversion itself, we've got this enable black and white. These sliders here relate to the original color data that you had. So in other words, if I go to my black and white here, most of my color data was yellow and orange and so on. I can change how this image feels by playing with these selectors. So in other words, if I tell it the yellows in this picture, I want you to get lighter or darker, that's going to have a big effect on the whole image for sure, because the whole image was pretty yellow. But what about things like, where was it? I found it earlier. Was it cyan or was it blue? There we are, the blues. I knew I found it somewhere. Look at our floor here with this reflection. Now, if we really want to drive the viewer to look down that corridor, we've got the option to do it by pulling these blues down. And that just gets rid of some of this shine, some of the reflection, some of the reflected blue light, funnily enough, that came from the yellow that was hitting this pavement down here. So with a black and white conversion, remember, you've also got these sliders in here. So everything on this edit I like. It's done really well, really subtly sympathetic. It's good in terms of detail. A little bit of an issue with some of this stuff blowing out a little bit out here. But again, that's just going to be a case of pulling down these sliders a bit more. You can get away with it. Some of this is overexposed, but you've done a good job of recovering it. But never forget, with the black and white conversion, under your color tab at the bottom, you've got your enable black and white, but these sliders are actually really powerful because they can control which bits are being brightened or darkened based on their original color in the image. So as you can see in here, there's blues and greens and magentas and so on down here, not just the yellows. So as I pull down the blues, the greens and the magentas, especially that one there, if you just see there, this one flagstone here, as I pull it down, we darken that area here. So I can use this to say everything that was genuinely yellow and red and that bright orange light, keep it where it is. Everything that was another color, pull it down, make it less distracting. So we've got that roadway in. And if I were to undo this and read it, you can see the difference. It's very subtle, but it just gets that sheen away from the floor so that we're looking down down the corridor. Okay, and then Michael's just asked just before, I'm going to finish in a second. So if Capture One selects a donor area for a heal which is outside your crop, but you want to change it, how would you do it? Unfortunately, there's a usability thing here, Michael, so you would have to go back to your pre-crop version, change it, and come back in. So I'll just show you an example. Let's go into there. And if I were to choose a heel brush there, and this was for some reason outside of my crop, I can't quite get to it because the second I move my mouse over here, it disappears. I would have to go back to that original crop to allow me to go and find it. And in fact, I may have even moved it too far. Yeah, I've moved it too far out of the actual frame. You'd have to delete that healing point and start again, unfortunately. It's something that I know a few people have mentioned. We've just got to be careful with it. And I'm sure at some point it'll improve somehow. Okay, guys, so that's the end of today's session. David, I think in a moment is going to be running a session on layers on the Capture One thing, specifically going into the use of layers in editing. I think that's now. But in the meantime, remember you've got access into that Facebook group where we'll have lots of arguments over pricing and all the other stuff that goes on in there. But more importantly, we can talk about the challenges you've got with images in between these sessions. Remember, you've got those YouTube pro tips things that you can keep watching. Do send in more images. We've got loads still to get through. We will do, but obviously send more in as you have them ready. So paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. And in the meantime, between now and this same time next week, stay safe, do what you're told, and we will catch up in a week. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.